The Land of Stories, Wishing Spell, Chapter 1. Once upon a time. Once upon a time, Miss Peters said to her sixth grade class, "These are the most magical words in our world has ever known, and a gateway into the greatest stories ever told. They're an immediate calling to anyone who hears them, a calling into a world where anyone is welcome and anything can happen. Mice can become men, maids can become princesses, and they teach valuable lessons in the process." Alex Bailey eagerly sat straight up in her seat. She usually enjoyed her teacher's lessons, but this was something especially close to her heart. "Fairy tales are much more than silly bedtime stories," the teacher continued. "The solution is every problem imaginable can be found in the outcome of a fairy tale. Fairy tales are life lessons disguised with colorful characters and solutions. The Boy Who Cried Wolf teaches us the value of a good reputation and power of honesty. Cinderella shows us the reward of having a good heart. The Ugly Duckling teaches us the meaning of inner beauty." Alex's eyes were wide and she nodded in agreement. She was a pretty girl with bright blue eyes, short strawberry blonde hair that was always kept neatly out of her face with a headband. The way the other students stared at Alex as if the lesson was being taught in another language was something Mrs. Peters had never grown accustomed to. So Miss Peters would often direct entire lessons to the front row where Alex sat. Mrs. Peters was a tall, thin woman who always wore dresses that resembled old patterned sofas. Her hair was dark and curly and sat perfectly on top of her head like a hat, and her students often thought it was. Through a pair of thick glasses, her eyes were permanently squinted from all the judgment she had given to her classes over the years. "Sadly, these timeline tales are no longer relevant to our society," Miss Peters said. "We have traded brilliant teachings for small-minded entertainment like television and video games. Parents now let obnoxious cartoons and violent movies influence their children. The only exposure to tales some children acquire were versions bastardized by film companies. Fairy tale adaptations were usually stripped of every moral lessons of stories that were originally intended to teach, and replaced with singing and dancing forest animals. I recently read that films are creating a deeper Cinderella as a struggling hip-hop singer, and Sleeping Beauty as a warrior princess battling zombies." "Awesome," a student said behind Alex whispered to himself. Alex shook her head. Hearing this made her soul hurt. She tried to share her disapproval with her fellow classmates. Sadly, her concern was not repeated. "I wonder if the world would be a different place if everyone knew these tales in the way the Brothers Grimm, and Hans Christian Andersen intended them to be known," Mrs. Peters said. "I wonder if people would learn from the Little Mermaid's heartbreak when she dies at the end of her real story. I wonder if there would be so many kidnappings, if children would show the true dangers that Little Red Riding Hood faced. I wonder if the delinquents would be so inclined to misbehave that if they knew about the consequences for Goldilocks called herself with 3 bears. There's so much to learn and prevent for our futures. We just need to open our eyes and pass the teaching." Would have been very proud. "Nicely put, Miss Bailey," she said. "I must say, in all my years of teaching, I rarely come across a pupil with as much in-depth knowledge as—" Suddenly a loud snore came from the back of the classroom. A boy in the back row was slouched over his desk and drooling in the corner of his mouth, very much asleep. Alex had a twin brother. It was moments like these that made her wish she didn't. Mrs. Peters devoted her attention to him like a paperclip to a magnet. "Mr. Bailey," Miss Peters asked. He continued to snore. "Mr. Bailey," Miss Peters asked, kneeling down closer to him. He let out another enormous snore. A few of the students wondered how it was possible for such a loud noise to come out of him. "Mr. Bailey," Miss Peters shouted in his ear. As if someone had lit a firework under his seat, Connor Bailey jumped back to life, almost knocking his desk over. "Where am I? What happened?" Connor asked with a panicked state of confusion. His eyes darted around the room while his brain tried to remember where he was. Like his sister, he also had bright blue eyes and strawberry blonde hair. His face was round and freckled, and at the moment slightly smushed to one side like a basset hound when it first wakes from a nap. Alex couldn't have been more embarrassed by her brother. Besides sharing looks at a birthday, she and her brother couldn't have been more difficult. Connor had many of friends, but unlike his sister, he had trouble with school, mostly trouble staying awake. "I'm so glad you could rejoin us, Mr. Bailey," Miss Peters said sternly. "Did you have a nice nap?" Connor turned bright red. "I'm so sorry, Miss Peter," he apologized, trying to be as genuine as possible. "Sometimes when you talk for long periods of time, I doze off. No offense, but I can't help it." "You fall asleep in my class at least twice a week," Miss Peters reminded him. "Well, you do talk a lot." Before he could stop himself from saying it, Connor knew it was the wrong thing to say. A few of the students had to bite their hands to stop them from laughing. I recommend you stay awake while I teach, Mr. Bailey," Miss Peters threatened. Connor had never seen anyone squint their eyes so tight without shutting them before. "Unless you know enough about fairy tales to teach this lesson yourself," she added. "I probably do," Connor said. Once again, he spoke without thinking. "I mean, I know a lot of stuff, that's all." "Oh, really?" Mrs. Peters never backed down from a challenge. And every student's worst nightmare was that they'd have her challenge her. "All right, Mr. Bailey, if you're so knowledgeable, answer this question." Connor gulped. "In the original tale of Sleeping Beauty, how many years does the princess sleep before she's awoken by a true love's kiss?" Miss Peters asked, studying his face. All eyes were on him, impatiently waiting for the slightest indication that he didn't know the answer. But fortunately for Connor, he did. 100, Connor asked. Sleeping Beauty slept for 100 years, and that's why the castle grounds were covered in vines and stuff. Because the curse affected everyone in the kingdom, and there was no one to guide in. Mrs. Peters didn't know what to say or do. She frowned down at him, immensely surprised. This was the first time anyone had ever been correct when she'd put this spawn on them, and she certainly hadn't expected it. "Try to stay conscious, Miss Bailey. Lucky for you, I used my last attention slip this morning, but I can always request for more," Miss Peters said, and promptly walked to the front of the classroom to continue her lesson. Connor sighed with relief, and the red drained from his face. His eyes met his sister's. Even she was surprised he had gotten the answer right. Alex hadn't expected Connor to remember any fairy tales. "Now, class, I want you all to go to your literature books and turn to page 170 and read Little Red Riding Hood quietly to yourself," Miss Peters instructed. The students did as they were told. Connor made himself as comfortable as possible on his desk and began reading. The story, the pictures, and the characters were so familiar to him. One thing Alex and Connor looked forward to the most when they were very young had been the trips to see their grandmother. She lived in the mountains in the heart of the woods in a tiny house that could be best described as a cottage if such things still existed. It was a long journey, a few hours by car. But the twins loved every minute of it. Their anticipation would grow as they traveled up the windy roads and through the endless trees, and when they crossed the yellow ridge, the twins would excitedly exclaim, "We're almost there! We're almost there!" Once they arrived, their grandmother would greet them at the door with open arms and hugs so tight that they would almost pop. "Look at you two! You've both grown a foot since last time I saw you," Grandma would say, even if they hadn't, and then lead them inside, where a freshly baked batch of cookies waited for them. Their father had grown up in the woods and would spend hours each day telling the twins his adventures as a kid. All the trees he'd climbed, all the streams he'd swum, and all the ferocious animals he'd barely escaped from. Most of the retellings were highly exaggerated, but they loved this time with him more than anything else in the world. "Someday, when you're older, I'll take you to all these secret places where I used to play," their father would tease them. The tall man was kind, and he would wrinkle whenever he smiled. He smiled quite a bit, especially when he was teasing the twins. At night, the twins' mother would help their grandmother cook dinner. After they'd eaten, as soon as the dishes were done, the family would sit around the fireplace, and their grandmother would open their big storybooks. And she and her father would take turns reading the twins' fairy tales until they fell asleep. Sometimes the Bailey family would be up until sunrise. They told stories with such detail and passion in it didn't care how many times the twin heard the same story. They were the best memories any child could ask for. Unfortunately, the twins hadn't been back in their grandmother's cottage in a very long time. "Mr. Bailey," Mrs. Peters shouted. Connor had dozed off again. "Sorry, Mrs. Peters," he bellowed back, sitting straight up in his seat like a soldier on guard. If looks could kill, Connor would have been dead from the scowl she was sending him. "What did we think of the real Red Riding Hood?" the teacher asked. A girl with frizzy hair with thick braids raised her hand. "Miss Peters," the frizzy-haired girl asked, "I'm confused." "And why is that?" Miss Peters was asking. As if Miss Peters was asked, "What on earth could possibly be confused about, idiot?" "Because it says the big bad wolf pack is killed by the hunter," the frizzy-haired girl explained. I always thought the wolf was just upset because the other wolves in his pack made fun of his snout, and he and Red Riding Hood became friends in the end. At least that's what happened in the cartoon I used to watch when I was little." Mrs. Peters rolled her eyes so far into the back of her head that she could have seen what was behind her. "That," she said with a clenched jaw, "is exactly why we're having this lesson." The frizzy-haired girl became so wide-eyed and sad. How could something so dear to her be so wrong? "For homework," Miss Peters said. The room simultaneously slumped in their seat. "You are to pick your favorite fairy tale and write a paper due tomorrow on the real lessons the tale is trying to tell us." Miss Peters went to the desk and the students began working on their assignment with the little class time remaining. Mr. Bailey, Mrs. Peters summoned Connor to her desk. A word. Connor was in deep trouble, and he knew it. He cautiously stood up and walked to Mrs. Peters' desk. The other students gave him a sorrowful look as he walked past, as if he was going to an executioner. Yes, Mrs. Peters? Connor, I'm trying to be very sensitive about your family situation, Miss Peters said, glaring at him over the frames of her glasses. Family situation. 2 words Connor had heard so many times over the last year. However, Miss Peters continued, there's just certain behavior that I will not tolerate in my classroom. You're constantly falling asleep in class, don't pay attention, not to mention your quiz and tests is very poorly. Your sister seems to be functioning just fine. Perhaps you could follow her example? It was a comparison that felt like a kick in the stomach every time someone made it. Indeed, Connor was not his sister by any means. He was always punished because of it. If this continues, I will be forced to have a meeting with your mother. Do you understand? Mrs. Peter warned him. Yes, sir. I meant ma'am. Sorry, just had been the best day. Okay, then. You may have a seat. Connor slowly walked back to his seat, his head hanging slightly lower than it had all day. More than anything, he hated feeling like a failure. Alex watched the entire conversation between her brother and her teacher. As much as her brother embarrassed her, she did feel for him as only a sister could. Alex flipped through her literature book, deciding on which story to write about. The pictures weren't as colorful and exciting as they had been in their grandma's book. But seeing all the characters she had grown up reading about made her feel at home, a feeling that she had recently become a rarity. If only fairy tales were real, she thought. If only somebody could have a wand and magically make things how they used to be.